Hi, listeners. This is the Economics Detective Podcast. I'm Garrett Peterson. Today's episode features psychologist Stuart Ritchie and a discussion of his book, Science Fiction's How Fraud, Bias, Negligence, and Hype Undermine the Search for Truth. It's a great conversation where we discuss the nature of science, the pitfalls facing scientists in recent years that have led to the replication crisis. Then we discuss some of the negative, perverse incentives that have created this crisis and the ways that it can be fixed. It was an enjoyable conversation to have, and I hope it'll be an enjoyable conversation for you to listen to. But before I start with that, I just want to make a personal note. Longtime listeners will know that I am a PhD student in economics in Vancouver, Canada. What you may not know is that I'm going to be defending my dissertation very soon, next couple months. And that means that I am job searching in a historically strange and chaotic labor market environment. So this is a personal request that if you are currently hiring for an economist position or you know of an organization that is, I'd like to hear about it. So you can go to economicsdetective.com and click on the About Me button to get my contact information. If you know about an economics or data science job that would be suitable for a recently graduated economics PhD, that's exactly the kind of thing I want to know about. At first, I'm only going to be open to remote or Vancouver-based jobs, but I could open up to other locations potentially in the future. If that's you, I'd really appreciate to hear from you. And whether or not that's you, I hope you enjoy this episode. You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Stuart Ritchie of King's College London, and he is the author of a book entitled Science Fiction's How Fraud, Bias, Negligence, and Hype Undermine the Search for Truth. Stuart, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me on.
Your book, it's a really interesting topic. You're discussing some of the problems and pitfalls in science as we practice it today. Let's start the discussion by talking about your background. You're coming from psychology. What's your background in science, and how does it sort of shape your view of science's problems?
Yeah, well, as you say, I'm a psychologist, and during my PhD, which actually was kind of on educational issues in psychology and some kind of cognitive aspects, I've kind of moved on to do research on individual differences, so cognitive abilities, intelligence, that sort of stuff. But during my PhD, I kind of did a little side project, which was an attempted replication study of the very famous Darrell Bem psychic paper, so a parapsychology paper. And, that wasn't the focus of my PhD. It wasn't on parapsychology, although there are people at the University of Edinburgh, where I did my PhD, whose focus is parapsychology. So it's kind of a parapsychology focused department, or there's at least a couple of people in there who are focused on parapsychology. And that's obviously the study of what they call psi, so psychic abilities, like clairvoyance and extrasensory perception and telekinesis and all that kind of stuff. So this paper appeared in 2011 that apparently showed that undergraduate students at Cornell University had psychic powers of precognition, to predict what was happening in the future. This is across 9 different experiments in the paper, and we decided we'd try and replicate one of them because we found it rather skeptical. I mean, I can go into the details of what the experiment contained, but a lot of people, I'm sure, will have heard of this one. But we were quite skeptical, and so we tried to replicate the study, found null results, so we didn't find anything like the results that were found in the published paper. And then we tried to get this published in the same journal that had published the original results, and they said, sorry, we don't accept any replication studies. So whether the replication was positive or negative, they weren't interested in publishing it. And so that was my first experience of like, oh, okay, so the scientific journal system is not set up to just be a reflection of all of the studies that are done on a topic. There are kind of weird incentives here. It was very strange, not for the editor to say, sorry, we didn't think your replication was very good, or we found a flaw in your replication, it wasn't close enough to the original study, or something like that. It was, we just have a blanket policy that we never publish any replication studies. And I thought that was really weird and damaging. And so ever since then, even though I've kind of moved on to different stuff substantively, I've always been interested in this issue of replication. And actually, that was one of the things among several other kind of factors that happened around the same time. So there was a major fraud story around the same time, and there was a couple other sort of failed replication attempts. Around about that 2011, 2012 time, that was one of the things that really kicked off this discussion of the replication crisis. And then my book now is kind of, around about 10 years later, what's happened? What's the whole story? How is that spread out into other areas of science? And what have we learned in the past 10 years? So that's kind of where I got my interest in this replication thing. And I think where a lot of people got their interest, because a lot of people saw our story and the other stories happening and said, okay, wow, we really need to do some soul searching about the quality of the science here.
Yeah. I remember that parapsychology research. The blog Slate Star Codex had an article entitled "The Control Group is Out of Control," and the idea was, if we wanted to test whether science works, you maybe have one body of scientific research that where we know it's real and the thing being studied has a real effect, and then a control group where we know it's fake, and just to see if science reliably sifts the truth from falsehoods. But and of course that control might very well be parapsychology, because people really don't have psychic powers, or maybe only Cornell undergrads do, but most people don't. And yet it finds these big results and to you mentioned fraud. There have been some scientists who actively make up their data, but it doesn't seem like the parapsychology people are doing that. It's something else going on. Maybe it's something they're not even aware they're doing. But yeah, it's to any observer, it would seem that they are doing the same kind of scientific process as lots of other research that isn't so absurd, which really it's kind of a red flag for a lot of scientific results that seem plausible and were arrived at through an apparently sound process that something like parapsychology could have what looks like very strong results.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not at all in any way trying to say that this particular paper was fraudulent in any way. That's just another thing that happened at the same time. There was another fraud story. But you're absolutely right. The parapsychology, aside from that Slate Star Codex article, a similar argument's been made where parapsychology, I think Eric Jan Wagenmakers, who's a statistician, called parapsychology the jester in the court of science. So it's like the jester in the kind of Shakespearean sense, where he's like absurd and ridiculous and says silly sounding stuff, but actually is making a really good point, and is making like a really sharp and important point about maybe in Shakespeare it would be the king, King Lear or whatever, but in science it's our methods. And as you say, what Darrell Bem did in that paper, which was published in a mainstream psychology journal, a journal that, by the way, if you got a publication in that journal, which is the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, if you got a publication in that journal, that's something that's like a career-making thing, or like a really important thing. If you have 2 or 3 publications in that journal, you're a really strong candidate for a job at a psychology department, in the US or elsewhere. I've seen people look at people's CVs and say, "Oh, okay, 3 JPSP articles. Yeah, that's pretty impressive." He published it there, and he used perfectly normal psychological statistics, and indeed statistics that are used across lots of different fields of science as well. T-tests and correlations, and setting up experiments where there were 50 participants in some of them, and some of them had 150, some of them had 200, and there's some interesting questions about exactly how he determined the sample sizes and so on. But all of the things he was doing in that experiment also apply to just standard mainstream research that everybody else was doing in psychology at the same time. And so, yeah, it was an amazing kind of illustration that what was happening in the field of psychology, if it gave us these absurd results, was maybe not particularly conducive to truth. And it should also be said that there is a whole field. This wasn't the first time parapsychology results had been published in psychology journals. This every so often it happens. There's a big flare up in about 1994 when there was a meta-analysis published that claimed that people could sense what was happening in different rooms and so on. It does happen every so often. It's just that in this case, it kind of happened around about the same time as lots of other stuff that really kicked off this replication crisis discussion.
Before we dive into the replication crisis, let's talk a little bit about science works and how it ideally should work before we diagnose. Let's establish what a healthy patient looks like before we diagnose it with several terrible illnesses. One thing I sort of liked in your discussion of science in the book was your focus on science as a social process. So normally when I think about science, I think about, gathering data and analyzing it and, having falsifiable hypotheses. And of course, all of those are parts of science, but you emphasize the fact that science is social, that the seminars and the discussions and the scientists trying to convince other scientists that their results are correct is essential to science. So talk a little bit about that perspective on science and how it works.
Yeah, it's something that's been discussed by quite a few philosophers of science, but the idea is that science is not just a thing which can happen with one person. You make a discovery in your lab and that's it. You have to also convince the rest of the world, other scientists in your field and in other fields, that what you've done is correct. You have to convince them that you've made a discovery, and so that's why we've got our system of peer-reviewed journals. Why we got journals in the first place? They were to allow scientists to share their findings with other interested scientists. That's where the first journal, the Royal Society Journal, came. That was the kind of thinking behind that, allowing scientists to share their ideas. And I think the argument I make in the book is that this is a major strength of science, because of course it's where the peer review process comes in. Your finding only gets considered a part of the literature if it's been scrutinized by other researchers. I mean, even though I do point out that peer review is actually peer review as a standard is actually quite recent. It wasn't the case that every single journal, you would just expect your papers to be peer reviewed as standard, up until about the 1970s, actually. Although the idea of peer review had been around much longer than that, it wasn't a kind of a rigid standard like the peer review gatekeepers kick in until about the 1970s. But anyway, this is the idea that it's a great strength of science that we have all these different perspectives, other people coming in and saying, well, actually, this isn't right because I, know this research and I've spotted this statistical flaw and I've spotted this design flaw. But it's science's greatest weakness as well, because the people doing the scrutinizing and the people doing the convincing, who are trying to convince other people, are all human beings too, and they are all the sorts of human beings are the sorts of creatures who are liable to cut corners to try and convince each other. They're liable to hype things up to try and convince each other. They're liable sometimes to make things up to try and convince each other. And so there's this kind of tension between the really great things about science being a social process and the really negative and worrying things. And this we've evolved this system in science, this peer review system of journals and sharing results and so on, to try and combat the individual flaws and biases of scientists, right? The whole point of peer review is that we are skeptical of results, and we submit every result to this kind of process of what Robert Merton, the sociologist that I quote quite a lot in the book, called organized skepticism. But the problem is that due to sort of pressures, which I'm sure we'll get into, the current kind of incentive system in academia, that peer review system regularly fails to produce to do its task, which is to stop bad research from getting through into the scientific record. So I really like the idea of thinking about science as a sort of social thing, because I think it highlights both its strengths and its weaknesses at the same time, and it helps us think about ways of trying to deal with those. And again, I'm sure we can get into the sort of some of the solutions that I propose later on as well. It's
a really interesting take on science, and it's and I think one might naively think like, oh, if only we could just have like these really consistent rules and take all the sort of messy human elements out of science, then it'd all be accurate and good. But that's very much an essential part that we have to sort of live with. Yeah, and so let's now let's talk a little bit about replication crisis. So, of course, you're a psychologist. A lot of this, at least to my knowledge, a lot of the replication crisis kind of started in social psychology with many results in that field. Kind of, people started trying to replicate them, and a lot of very prominent, celebrated results from top journals and top people with a lot of high status within their field were overturned. But of course, it wasn't just limited to social psychology. It also happened in many other fields as well. So let's talk a little bit about the replication crisis.
Yeah, you're right to say social psychology is kind of where a lot of this stuff started, and social psychology, for a long period, social psychology had this kind of focus on these priming results. There was a lot of social psychology coming out, which was what some people call social priming. Other people don't like that term, but social priming has been described as this idea that the world has all these influences in it that unconsciously affect our behavior. So even just someone saying a phrase or some kind of idiom, or even just bringing some idea, some metaphor to mind, can cause a huge change in your behavior. And that's an idea that, the one of the most infamous instances of this that I describe in the book is this paper on the social priming of age. So the concept of age. So you had people sitting in a room doing a psychology, like a standard cognitive psychology, like linguistics type task, where you had to unscramble a sentence. But one of the words in the sentence for one group always had to do with age. So it was like old, grey, knitting. I think Florida was one of the words that they used. Because in the US that's associated with old age. Apparently, that's not one that I associate with old age. But and then the other group, that they were these were just random words. And then this is a paper that came out, by the way, in 1996, I think, mid-90s anyway. And the idea was that when the people had seen the words that were to do with age, they walked more slowly out of the lab than the people who just saw the random words. So they actually physically, like the concept that had been activated in their minds had caused their behavior to change. And there was a famous failed replication of that in 2012, where the original authors of the original study got really upset about it. And that spawned a whole set of easy to describe or easy to kind of hype up social psychology type studies, where it's like, if you prime the concept of I don't know, if you put in the concept of guilt, or you've done something bad, then that will physically make you wash your hands more when you walk out the room. One of my very favorite ones is one where there's a cardboard box in the middle of the room, and you get people to do a creativity test, either sitting in the cardboard box or just to the side of the cardboard box. And what they found in this paper was that there was a huge dramatic effect where the people who were sitting outside the box, and thus thinking outside the box, did much better on the creativity test than the people who were inside the box. Like, unbelievable results like that. These were published in some of the top mainstream psychology journals, in the period of the kind of 90s and early 2000s. There's a whole proliferation of this stuff. And it started failing to replicate. So whenever people, after this kind of replication crisis thing started, when people started saying, well, maybe we should try running, instead of, going on to our next idea, and trying to sort of follow up on this research, let's run a direct replication. Let's run the experiment exactly as possible. So really, trying to replicate the exact conditions of the experiment again and see what happened. And this is what we did with the parapsychology study. We used exactly the same software, the same word lists, the same. We did it as directly as we possibly could. And this is where you started getting a lot of failed replications. And then people took this outside of social psychology and they said, well, okay, how are cognitive psychology results doing? In terms of their replicability. And then economists started coming along and saying, well, what about behavioral economics? That's like psychology. Maybe it's subject to the same kind of problems. And sure enough, they tried to replicate some experiments and found that quite a lot of them, 40% or something, don't seem to replicate very easily. And then that spreads out even further. And you can see, in the book, I kind of list the different fields where this has become a problem. And scariest of all, of course, is when this happens in medicine, in medical research, like in preclinical research, where you have all these studies like of different associations of various different biological factors with cancer, tumor growth, and they seem to have real trouble replicating them. These are things which aren't just silly priming effects that might make you chuckle and then turn the page in the journal. These are things which are being translated up to treatments for people with cancer. So it's and my kind of argument in the book is that it's the same sorts of incentives, the same kinds of problems that underlie the failed replications across many different fields of research. And of course, along with all this replication crisis discussion, there's been a debate about exactly what counts as a replication, and I think that's a perfectly fine debate to have. Like, is it just someone coming along and getting a statistically significant result in the same direction, or do they have to get exactly the same effect size? Like, is it the same size of effect that they find in the data? By the way, it's often about half the size when you do a replication study. Like, the original study seems to be overstating not just whether the effect is there, but how big it is as well. If you do indeed successfully replicate it, it's often found to be about half the size or smaller than original anyway. So there's a huge debate, and some people don't even think that there is a replication crisis. Crisis is a bit of a kind of dramatic sounding term, and maybe we don't even need to talk about that. I still think, and I argue in the book, that some of the fixes that I give for science would be worth doing, even if there wasn't a replication crisis. Although I think we clearly have a problem, and if you survey scientists, they do. Majorities of them, very large majorities, do agree that there is something strange going on here. So I think you saw this starting in social psychology, and I don't think this is, these problems were new. I mean, people had been discussing issues of, bias in research and all that for decades, even hundreds of years. But it seemed something around 2011-12 happened where we started really digging into this, and we had more metadata. We had more of these the ability to go and do large-scale multi-lab replication attempts, which is obviously much easier in the age of the internet and so on than it was back in the 90s, say. So that's kind of where the replication crisis is, and there's lots of different proximal and ultimate causes for why that might be the case, but yeah, that's where it goes from social psychology and then bleeds out into science in general.
I'd say the replication crisis is, I think, a bit of a misnomer. It's kind of like if there was a plague and you suddenly started diagnosing lots of people with plague, calling it the diagnosis crisis, it kind of like it's not so much the failure to replicate that's the problem. It's the problem is that the original studies had these big flashy results that were, many of them apparently not true.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. That you're maybe it should be the replicability crisis, right? Because it's the quality of the original studies that is the thing being impugned here. The people that are coming along and replicating them are doing what we should be doing in science. Like in most cases, there are lots of cases that don't fit this. Like if you do a scientific study of a one-off event, no one's going to be able to replicate it, but you can still do it in a high quality way. But in theory, someone should be able to come along, and if they did the same thing again, they find something similar to the same, something similar to the result that you discovered. But yeah, I hadn't ever considered that before. Like, it's not the replication that's the problem; it's the quality of the original studies and the unreliability and the lack of robustness in the results that they are apparently reporting.
Yeah, and we can imagine, if we just didn't try to replicate them, that we just kind of go on and we have our status hierarchies in science based on, this person discovered this amazing priming result, and now they're they've got tenure and they're making hiring decisions at an elite university and hiring other people who have interesting priming results, and you can imagine science just kind of drifting for a long time, just away from, if you're using methods that do not reliably lead to the truth. Science could just sort of drift away from what is true and real, and sort of become this strange, activity where people just sort of share false information with each other and get grant money to come up with more false information. But we really don't want that.
Wouldn't it be terrible if something like that? Wouldn't it be terrible if something like that had happened? Well, my friend Richard Morey did a great lecture at a conference a few years ago where he talked about. So there's a Daniel Dennett paper about chess, and it's a game that's like chess, but I can't remember the exact thing. But like the king can move as many squares as he wants in any direction or something. So it like breaks the game of chess. It's not everything. It looks like chess, but it's chess because it's not quite the same. And you can study chess if you want, and you can look into you can spend your life studying chess and thinking about chess. But actually, no one has ever played this game, and no one cares about it. It doesn't have any cultural history. It doesn't have any strategies. It doesn't have hundreds and thousands of books and a whole history of competitions and tournaments and so on. So it's a thing which you've just made up. You've just decided that the king can move differently, and so you can spend your life researching that. And what Richard said in his lecture was that there's also a thing called science, which looks a little bit like science, where scientists are publishing papers, and as you say, they're like, we're giving prestige to people who publish lots of good papers with flashy looking results, and we're sending them off to top universities, and we're allowing them to make decisions on who else gets into these top universities. And it sort of looks, to all intents and purposes, like science. They're getting grants from the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health and all these places, and they're saying that they're making scientific progress. But actually, they're just playing a game that looks a little bit like science, but isn't really. They're doing something which is important to academics, perhaps, and gives them a sense of purpose and gives them, their salaries and, their sense of prestige and and status and so on. But it doesn't actually do the thing that science is supposed to be doing, which is reliably, as you just said, reliably uncovering the truth. So, that's I think a really nice way of thinking about it. Like that, at its worst, science could be like a kind of make work program for very smart people, and I think it has in some fields become that. And we desperately need to get away from that.
Yeah, I'm recalling an economic history paper I saw presented, and it was talking about the Song Dynasty in China, and which is one of the most educated, pre-modern societies. Some would argue that Song Dynasty was, in some ways early modern. It had it was starting to industrialize at that time, but They were so educated, but what everyone was studying was Confucian texts. That was the way you got into the bureaucracy, by knowing these Confucian texts inside and out and being able to take these these exams on them. And I should track down this paper, but the authors they had a catalog of all the books published, and there were some books about math and science coming out at that time, but in this explosion of having this exploding, increasing educated class, they were all talking about and writing about ancient Confucian texts and not about math and science for the most part. And so despite being a very highly educated society, didn't produce the kind of advances that that a similarly educated society focusing on real science and real math might have. But to an outside observer, that looked a lot like science, but it just didn't produce growth in the same way that discovering new laws of physics or inventing a steam engine or medical advances would deliver.
That sounds fascinating. I'd love to see that paper, actually. And I kind of wish I'd seen that before I wrote the book, because that sounds like a really good example to include.
Yeah, I'll try to track that down. It was like a working paper, but maybe have the author on for a future episode. But let's talk more about your book. So in the subtitle, you name fraud, bias, negligence, and hype as four problems in science. Do you want to start with fraud that we mentioned earlier? Some scientists, it's not super common, will simply fabricate results. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So this is, I put this as the first chapter in the book because it's kind of the flashiest and most exciting thing, I guess. But the point I was making by doing that was saying, let's get this out of the way, because it is a small number of people. I happen to think that it's a lot more prevalent and a lot more serious than we would like to think. Scientific fraud, I think we kind of don't want to see it, because we don't want to believe that there's all these people in our midst who are making up results, fabricating their data, changing things in ways that are dishonest. And you often bring this up to people. You mention scientific fraud, and the first thing they say is, well, there's not that many people that commit scientific fraud, right? And you sort of say, well, let's try and work it out, and let's just see how big how serious a problem it really is. Let's actually look at it. And so I talk about a few different, there's some anecdotes in there of scientists who have committed fraud, including some who have led to the deaths of people, when fraud comes into medicine. And then I talk about some of the actual research that's done on fraud. And there's probably still to date the most reliable survey of scientists that just asks them, have you ever committed scientific fraud or misconduct? About 2% in that study. I think it's like 1.99 or something percent, or what, something like that. Around about 2% anyway of scientists say yes to that question. And obviously, it's quite aversive to say yes to that question, so you'd imagine it would be slightly higher. And then you ask them, how many of your colleagues do you think have committed scientific misconduct? I think something around 14% of them say yes to that question. So it's, the perception at least is that there's quite a lot of this going on, and a lot of people know someone who they think has probably fabricated data or committed some kind of fraudulent act with their data. And that reflects my experience of talking to scientists. When I was writing this book, I mentioned what I was writing about, and people would say, oh, you should check the research of, X person. Have a look at this person. Have a look at this person at this university. And there's kind of, over dinner, kind of at the pub sort of discussions where people say, I think that person might be fiddling things a little bit. So this happens quite a lot, and it's often very difficult to spot. Sometimes it's very easy to spot, and there have been scientists who have, tried their best to kind of cover their tracks in terms of their fabricating their data or photoshopping their microscope images or whatever it happens to be, and it's really obvious to people. Sometimes seemingly not obvious to peer reviewers, but then when the paper gets published, it's automatically there's sort of a community of people online. People notice, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. This image is identical to this image, but apparently they're supposed to come from two entirely different, petri dishes or whatever it is. And so there does seem to be this kind of this problem. And the interesting thing is how we deal with that. I've already mentioned that people are reluctant to even think about it in many cases. Universities certainly are reluctant to deal with fraudulent scientists that they employ. There's been many cases of universities really dragging their feet. I recount the story of Paolo Macchiarini, who is this surgeon who gave people these artificial windpipes. And at the Karolinska Institute, which is one of the best universities in the world, it's where you get the Nobel Prize for medicine and physiology. That's where it's kind of awarded from. And the university there dragged their feet for ages, even though they had actually got an independent inquiry set up by someone at a different university. Then they just disagreed with the results of that inquiry, which said the guy was fraudulent. Ran their own inquiry, which acquitted him, and broadcasted that out to the world. It then became clear that there were really some very, very serious problems, and this was kind of publicized, and they could no longer deny it. But even some of our top academic institutions are really recalcitrant when it comes to dealing with fraudsters that are, in their employ or are related to them in some way. And you can understand why that is. It's very bad PR, although arguably it's worse PR if you cover up a fraudster and don't listen to whistleblowers, or indeed in some cases punish the whistleblowers, which has happened in a few cases too. Journals have often been quite bad at dealing with this as well. It's a terrifying thing, right? You have lots of scientists on your team. They're all your colleagues, sometimes your friends, and you're working with them, and you're excited to put out the next, paper. And then it turns out that one of your colleagues has besmirched your name and all the other colleagues on your paper by making data up. It's nothing to do with you. You weren't involved in it at all, but it happens. I mean, that's a nightmare scenario, and it's happened to so many people. So, that's one of the most extreme and kind of like, it's one of the worst derelictions of duty of a scientist. Of course, the whole point is that you're discovering things which are true and not making stuff up. I talk a little bit about what the psychology of that might be, like why these people are doing this. Although I don't think we really have a very good model of what is going on in the mind of someone who is fabricating data and trying to publish it in journals. But so there's multiple different problems there. There's the problem that the fraudulent research is done in the first place, and that it gets into the peer-reviewed literature, and then that often people take far, far, far too long to retract those papers, get them out of the scientific literature, and in some cases, where it's necessary, punish the fraudster that made the data up.
It's tough because I know every single example that you're going to use by its nature is going to be a case of fraud that's been exposed. Because if it hasn't been exposed, you can't write about it, right? So, so thinking about each of these examples are a case of a fraudster who was caught. Maybe they weren't caught super fast, but that's sort of science working how it should, where the fraudsters, don't get away with it forever. Even if they get away with it for a bit, but maybe there's some very clever fraudster out there, or maybe there's thousands of them who just never get caught. And of course, none of them are going to appear in your book because just by the nature of not getting caught, you don't end up in a chapter about fraud.
Yeah, a lot of the people I talk about were discovered because they made sloppy errors. They had tables of data that looked far too similar, and as soon as someone looked at them, they could see something was amiss there. The normal kind of variance and means and standard deviations and so on of data would be quite different across different treatment conditions, different experimental conditions, and so on. And often in fraudulent papers, they're identical or far too close than they would be under any realistic circumstances. So these are people who've slipped up and made really dumb mistakes in their fraud. Yeah, you're absolutely right that there could be people out there. There probably are. There must be people out there who we've not caught because they are able to fabricate a really realistic looking data set, like a data set that looks like it wasn't generated by humans, but was generated by, a data generating process like collecting data out in the world. And, there's a slight fear that if we talk about fraud enough and we publicize all the fraud hunting techniques and so on, that people will work out ways of getting around them. And certainly people have tried. Again, there's, some fraudsters who've been caught have done their best to kind of cover up what they've done by like adding extra noise to their results, or just kind of jiggling around the figures a little bit to make it seem like there's the kind of normal statistical variation in their data that they've made up. And so there must be people who are doing that cleverly, and we will never catch them. And that is a terrifying thought.
Yeah, there's a whole field of this, and I've heard that it's actually very hard to make up. You can't just tell your computer to generate a normal distribution and then say, okay, and this group's going to have this mean and that group's going to have that mean and that variance. Like that is apparently detectable. It's too perfect. If you just sit and like write down a bunch of numbers by hand, there's some weird results where like when humans write down numbers, they have too many numbers ending in 7 or something like that. And so little things like but who knows if there's a like, really good fraudster out there who can, generate data that seems really, really true. And I suppose the only way to really catch that sort of person is to really try to replicate their results. And you would never know that the result was generated by fraud, but you could at least figure out that it was not accurate.
Yeah, that would be what would advance the science in that case, and so that's kind of the most important thing. Although, of course, obviously, finding and getting rid of, getting people out of science if they've fabricated data. Of course, one thing is making up a data set completely, like from whole cloth, is really difficult. But cutting, chopping bits off a data set, and sort of amending a data set, in an intentional, fraudulent way, is a much more plausible way of doing this, and it might easily be something that can wouldn't be noticed because maybe some of the data are real, maybe the majority of the data are real, but someone's gone in and changed the critical figures that are really important to give them the result that they want. And I think that sort of stuff is much more common, and that stuff blurs into the much more everyday, non-fraudulent, non-intentional, unconscious biases that people have in science, which I talk about in the next chapter. But there's this kind of blurred line between what is fraud, what counts as fraud, and what counts as as statistical bias. And I don't think there's really there are many cases that are in that grey area where people kind of know that if they do something with statistics, it's going to lead to it being more likely that they get the result they want. But they're not doing it in this. They're not kind of fully consciously doing it. But they sort of are. Like if you sat them down and said, that if you did that, it'd be more likely. If you I'm sure we can talk about this, the idea of p-hacking and so on. But if you run your statistic in this way, you're more likely to find a result that's conducive to your hypothesis. They would say, yeah, sure. Is that fraud? Maybe.
Yeah. You just assign a grad student to try out 100 different different specifications for your statistical model, and just tell you about the good ones.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and yeah, for listeners, that those statistical tests that we rely on the assumption that this is the only statistical test you're doing, because of course, if you do 100 statistical tests and find one extreme result, well, that. Yeah, the odds of doing one test and finding an extreme result, when there really is none, is pretty low. That's just what the p-value is. But that p-value is meaningless if you do many tests and then oh look, I found one extreme result among the 100 tests I tried. But let's talk a bit about bias. Like what kind of bias did you have in mind here? I think a lot of the time when we talk about bias, we mean like ideological bias, but I think you're talking about bias in a more sort of general sense.
Yeah, I do talk about ideological bias a little bit, but it's not the kind of main focus of the bias chapter, because I think ideological biases do clearly affect science in all different directions, and so do other biases. Like if you're getting paid to promote a particular result, then you're more likely to find it. Drug trials do show that pharmaceutical companies or research funded by pharmaceutical companies is more likely to get a positive result for the drug than research that's funded by non-profits or governmental organizations. So there's that kind of bias, but there's also the bias that's kind of inherent in this idea of wanting to publish lots of papers, which is that there's a bias towards finding positive results. And so we're in a system where academics are rewarded for publishing papers and publishing them in high impact journals. And what the high impact journals want is flashy, exciting findings. And flashy, exciting findings, the kind of operationalization of flashy and exciting in statistical terms, is a very low p-value, a statistically significant result. And that's how we've all collectively decided to judge the excitement of results. Is it statistically significant? And that's often just all you need in a paper. If you can find a statistically significant result, you can write that up for publication. And so there's two things that they do, which I kind of describe in the book. Is that one thing is publication bias, which is where you just don't publish results that don't come up with statistical significance. So this whole idea of the file drawer effect, where you run a study, it comes up with a null result, and you just think, well, I'll just move on and do something else rather than writing that one up and sending it off to a journal. But that has a downside, which is that you don't get the publication out of it. And as I said, scientists are judged quite strongly on the number of publications that they have on their CV. And in which journals, of course. So there are lots of ways which you can run your statistical analysis that make it more likely that you'll find that positive, statistically significant result, even if what you're really doing is kind of relying on chance variation in the results. And so that's where the p-hacking comes in, that you're trying to hack the data so that the p-value goes below the accepted statistical significance threshold of 0.05, which varies a tiny bit, but that's the normal threshold that people use for that particular statistic. If it gets below that, then you're golden. You can send your results to the journal, and the journal will be interested in it. If it's above that, even by a small amount, then you're out of luck. So there are ways of running your statistical analysis over and over and over again. As you said, if you run it again and again and again with slight variations, maybe you drop a few participants because you can kind of post hoc convince yourself these people weren't paying attention, so I'll drop them out. Or you can run a different statistical test. I ran this particular set of statistical analyses, but actually I should have done this one. Oh, and lo and behold, this one gives a significant result, so I'll publish that. You can dredge through a data set without really having a plan of what you're going to test. So one of these really big observational data sets, say, where they collect loads and loads and loads of information on people, or a big data set of economic performance across different countries, across different years, whatever, and lots of other factors about those countries. You can just dredge through data sets like that, running statistical model after statistical model, and eventually you will find something significant because of what you just described there about calculating a p-value over and over and over again with some variation will eventually mean that you find something just by a fluke. So there's these kind of different ways of getting to a result. If you're willing to just dredge, then you can do that. If you have a hypothesis in mind, there are ways of kind of hacking that down, hacking the data down so that they conform more closely to your hypothesis. And the really scary thing about all this, I'm talking about it as if it's a deliberate choice, just like the fraudsters. But the really scary thing is that you can convince yourself that what you've done is perfectly normal and perfectly good science and perfectly justified. This kind of post hoc rationale for research is a really scary thing, and it's really pervasive. There's pressure from senior scientists often to find results because those are the ones they know that get published in journals. And so explicitly sometimes, but more often implicitly, people are pushed into this kind of p-hacking their statistics to get them below that threshold. And I quote an example of one scientist who explicitly, it was a leaked email, and he explicitly asked his student, can we just run that analysis again and get that p-value below the threshold that we need? And that's a really, that's a rare instance of it. But that not many scientists would be foolish enough to put that in writing in an email, but that is what's happening in a lot of cases. People are saying, well, why don't you just run this again? Just try it again with this. Try it this way. Try it this way. And this flexibility, and it's undisclosed flexibility. That is, you don't write your paper as if, we ran this analysis and then we tried it again with this, we tried it again with this, we tried it again with this. That's the fundamental problem. If you wrote it like that, then the reader could see it and could say, oh, wow, these people, have actually run 100 different analyses here. So the fact that they've eventually found a significant result, a p-value below 0.05, is not that surprising. But what instead scientists do is they do run all those analyses, all those different variations on the analysis, and then write it up as if they had just run one analysis, and it happens usually to be the one that worked. So you're doing research that's very, the term people have used is exploratory. You've been exploring your data, which is fine, but then you write it up as if it was a confirmatory, that you were confirming a hypothesis that you always had right from the start, and a very specific statistical, hypothesis that's very that's specified in a very detailed way. So this problem of actually doing exploration but pretending that you're doing confirmation is something that really distorts the scientific literature, and that's where a lot of our problems come from.
Yeah, I like that point that sometimes it is valid to do lots of different, tests and analyses because you're searching for something and you don't know what's out there. But you got to be honest about the sort of searching you did because you see that reading papers where it's like, these papers in top journals, it's like, oh, we hypothesized that this effect happened, and look, it does. And it's like, how did you come to that? Are you just so brilliant that you intuited that, this particular factor would be important for this thing you're studying? It's often written in a way that it just seems like the researcher had this flash of insight that I bet this is important, and then they went and tested it, and it turned out it was. I'm thinking about
or they're psychic, right? I mean, maybe that parapsychology research was right all along.
Yeah, exactly. And we've got all the psychics at the top universities using their powers to discover novel results. Yeah, I'm thinking about just trying as a grad student to do that and be like, I bet this thing is important. Coming up with an elaborate test of it and then just getting a null result, and and just how hard it is to sit down and write that paper, trying to sort of sell a null result as interesting because why should you, the reader, bother with this theory I had that turned out not to be true? Is kind of it's tough. I fully understand the file drawer effect from that perspective.
Sure, and in a world of positive results, and in many fields, the percentage of positive results, that is, you've found what you originally had hypothesized. There's research on this. In psychology, it's above 90%, something like 94%, I think, of psychology papers that were studied in these kind of meta research investigations found positive results. And I don't think we would think it was 50-50. Because scientists do have an idea of what they're doing, but that's just not a realistic number of for a proportion of hypotheses that are successful. And I think we'd be if it was really the case that scientists were constantly finding positive results, then we'd either be in kind of a technological utopia, or we'd be wasting. It implies that scientists are wasting their time doing following up on really, really boring hypotheses that we already could predict were true, right? If they're right 94% of the time, we don't want that. But yeah, as you say, in an atmosphere like that, if you do your statistics and get a null result, it feels really bad. It feels really weird. It feels very like I'm inadequate in some way. I've not done this research correctly. I've not run this study right. So maybe then in that circumstance, you're a bit more vulnerable to being pushed by the general trends of the research or by the by the other people on your team, your PI, your supervisor, or whatever, to do this p hacking, to do this publication bias, to not publish the null results, or to try and kind of amend them in post hoc ways.
So let's talk then about negligence. Your third horseman of the apocalypse, I guess. It doesn't rise to the level of fraud. It's not deliberate, but it's just kind of lazy. In what ways, important ways, are scientists negligent in your opinion?
Well, there are like general problems which can be found across all different fields, which are things like typos in data sets, typos in statistical code, which should have been picked up at some point. There's an algorithm called StatCheck that was used again in my own kind of area of psychology. They looked at thousands of papers in psychology and found some huge percentage of them, something like over half, had some kind of inconsistent number. So a number through like the p-value and the standard error and the effect size, all of which should agree with each other. They're like three parts of a triangle. If you know two of them, you can work out the other one. So some huge portion of them were inconsistent with each other. So the research just hadn't reported the statistics correctly, and in some smaller proportion of cases, it was a really critical mistake where it might have flipped the results of the paper. So they were like reporting a statistically significant result when it wasn't, or vice versa. So that kind of thing happens quite a lot, and that's been done in psychology. And I suspect if you did that across other fields, you did it in, I don't know, evolutionary biology or cell biology or economics or other areas like that, you would also find inconsistencies with the numbers. I mean, it's the case in psychology that quite a lot of the results are written up using this particular style, where it's easy for an algorithm to just go through the text of the paper and find the relevant statistics. Other fields, it would be more difficult to do that, but I'm sure people could write algorithms and find these mistakes. So that's the kind of general problems. And then there's like more field-specific problems where you have entire fields which have these persistent problems, like in cell biology, where they have this problem of imposter cells, where cell lines, which are duplicating all the time, and you can get these immortal cell lines where you can keep these cells going forever and study them. It can be healthy cells or cancerous cells and cells from all different species. Where one cell line gets contaminated with another cell line. So you think you're studying human cell lines, and actually you're studying monkey cell lines or mice cell lines or rat cell lines. And this has been going on since the very first cell lines in the 1950s were described. And I was kind of baffled when I read through this, because there are these editorials in some of the world's top biology and general science journals saying, by the way, there's this terrible problem of imposter cells where you haven't cleaned your lab properly, you haven't sterilized everything properly, and one set of cells has taken over another one, and they grow at different rates. So sometimes the kind of faster growing cells will just overtake the entire population, and loads of papers get retracted each year because the cells were contaminated. And this is particularly problematic again in cancer research. So again, it's a field where it's really affecting people's lives. It's not just in inverted commas, science for the sake of science. This is medical research, and so you have all these kind of weird problems which can only be due to people just not following the proper lab procedures. Then you have statistical negligence, which kind of I describe in the form of the example I give is of statistical power, which is that people essentially are running studies that are too small to discover the thing that they claim to be interested in. So they're running studies which are, in psychology you'd have studies of 20 participants or something, looking for an effect which is probably quite small. And with 20 people, your chance of finding this very small effect is virtually nil. So that's problematic enough. But then there's a worse problem, which is that if you do happen to find an effect in your study, it's likely one that's been exaggerated. It's a pure fluke in that particular data set, and won't replicate, won't be found elsewhere. But then once you publish that study, which has got this grossly exaggerated result, which just happened to come about by a fluke, other people look at it and go, hey, you can find effects using this really small study. So I'm going to do a small study too. So it's its own cell line, I guess, its own like ever breeding cell line of bad research. I should have put that in the chapter. That's an analogy I should have made in the chapter to link up the first half to the second half. But it kind of perpetuates the problem, because we publish all this research, and then what are people going on when they design a new research study? They look back at the old research. They say, oh, well, the previous study that looked at this had 45 participants, so I'm going to maybe use 50 or whatever. When actually the number of participants you would need to study an effect that you're interested in would be like 500 or something, and so one bad study leads on in a kind of domino effect to more bad studies, and that can only be negligence, because we all learn about statistical power in our undergraduate statistics classes. We all know what it is. We all know that it's important, and we all know that we should be doing a statistical power analysis before we start our experiments. But people don't, and the reason that they don't is because they know that. Either they're just ignoring it because it's kind of the inertia of their lab is that that just holds them back. You just there's no standard for doing that, or they know that if they ran a statistical power analysis, they would find that they would need to do a much bigger study, and their life would be a lot harder. They would need to gather data on way more rats running around a maze, or way more participants, or way more cells, or whatever it is that they're studying. And that would make their life a lot harder. It would make it much longer until they publish, and it would make it much more expensive to run the study. So we get an awful lot of low-powered studies, which are low quality and end up, as I say, sort of perverting future research too.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you mentioned before, a lot of sort of seminal papers tend to overstate their effects, maybe like doubling, what the later replication will find. And of course, if you were doing your power analysis based on the assumption that the original study's effect is the real effect, then you would also tend to assume you only need a smaller sample to detect it, when in fact you need a larger one.
Absolutely, it's a terrifying problem. And I see, I sometimes do talks on this to other scientists, and they say things like, well, my graduate student doesn't have any funding, so they have to do a small study. Otherwise, they'll never publish anything. And I think that illustrates a lot of problems with what we're doing in science. Just getting a publication for the sake of publishing something is seen as more important than doing the science right and actually making a reliable contribution to the literature.
Well, you don't want to spend 9 years in grad school. That's I have a lot more sympathy for the grad students, cutting corners than the tenured professors who, in theory, have all the time in the world and don't have to rush through a dissertation, before they.
Sure, and they should know better as well.
Yeah, but of course it's the same people, just at different stages in their lives. So if you build bad habits early, I can. What reason is there to build good ones later? And just one other negligence note. Are you aware of the many genetic studies corrupted by Microsoft Excel interpreting some gene names as dates? There's a
Yes, I actually do. I think in a footnote or somewhere later in the book I do mention that, and I noticed that yesterday that we have now officially changed the names of human genes, or genes in general, I think, because Microsoft Excel keeps making this problem, and like some huge proportion of papers that have used Microsoft Excel have got this error where it's just like a really dumb statistical algorithm has changed the name of genes like Sept4 into September 4th and stuff like that.
Yeah, it was, you kind of. You're like, why are you using Microsoft Excel to manage your data? Why are you letting it make changes? But
a very good question.
Many people do, and it's a big problem. But rather than training every scientist to not do that, and not make those mistakes, or maybe change the setting in its Excel to not automatically detect dates. They just change the names of the genes, which I guess is an easier fix. So let's talk about hype. This is maybe the most kind of social problem with science, that scientists can kind of get caught up in hype. How do you define like hype in science? What do you mean by hype?
I mean, in terms of writing something about your results that your data can't support. So making claims, over claims about your results that your data can't support. So one of the main points that I wanted to try and get across in this chapter was that it's not that scientists are sitting there doing the research in this completely disinterested, very scientific way, and then journalists come along and like hype their results out of all proportion, or popular science writers write a book that makes all these errors. That does happen, of course, but one of my things I wanted to get across is that scientists are often involved in this. Scientists are often the ones that are making press releases, writing the press release themselves to get their research out into the world, and they often include incorrect statements in those press releases. So like the classic error of writing up a study that was done in mice as if it had implications for humans in the press release. So to the outside world, unless the journalist who writes the story based on that press release is very careful, it will look as if this study was done on humans, or it often won't be revealed until like the 8th paragraph of the news article, that it was never, no humans were involved in this, but it will say, this new social anxiety affects whatever it is, affects eating behaviors in this way, but it's in mice, not in humans. And so it would take a lot more to show that that's in humans, take a lot more research. You would follow the translational research. So that's what I want to get across, is that scientists are not innocent in this. They are writing the press release, they are hyping up their research. And then I also go on to discuss where scientists themselves write popular books where they hype up the conclusions of their research as well.
There's a Twitter account called @JustSaysInMice, and it just quote tweets science articles and says "in mice."
Yeah. It's great, and it's a wonderful service, and I think it's actually made a difference. Like I now see like in mice being included in news headlines where it would never have been before. So that's it's had an effect.
Maybe, I mean, we have many complaints about journalists maybe caring too much about what Twitter thinks, but maybe this specific Twitter account has sort of pressured them into doing that. It has over 70,000 followers, so wouldn't be surprised if
it's a brilliant idea by it's by James Heathers. He's a kind of data detective, data sleuth, and he's a neurophysiologist, and he's concerned with misleading science press releases, and so that's just a genius, a little stroke of genius that he did when he made that press release.
Yeah.
Sorry, he made that Twitter account, I should say.
Yeah,
and it's justifiably popular.
Yeah, and so there, we can get into the perverse incentives element of your book. Like, the reason people want to hype up their findings is because they have, it is good for your career to have a study that gets that gets people interested, that maybe gets a lot of attention, in the press. You, on the one hand, you want to impress the other scientists. On the other hand, you also want to impress the world with your flashy results. And do you want to talk a little bit about the perverse incentives you identify in science?
Yeah, there's this. We have this belief that scientists are doing scientific research because they want to discover stuff about the world. They want to help, solve problems. They want to make new things. But actually, the modern kind of academic system is one where as I've mentioned it several times already, because it's so important to modern academia, is that you've got to publish papers. You've got to publish papers in flashy, glamorous journals. You've got to get grants from, you get large grants to fund more of your research, which you then publish in those journals. And you've got to, as we've just been talking about, attract press attention, media attention. Fame is another thing that people are clearly often going for, and you've got to make your mark in some way. But the academic system itself, in terms of tenure and getting tenure, getting jobs, getting hired, getting promoted, these are, in large part, is based on what's on your CV. And if it's lots of papers published in, really top journals, then you're going to be doing really well. If it's lots of years where there's no publications, very little by way of grant income, and just the odd publication now and again, unfortunately, tenure committees are going to look at that, and hiring committees are going to look at that in a much more negative light. The fact that this is the root of a lot of academic problems is a really good theory for explaining a lot of the stuff we see. It explains the fraud and the bias and the negligence and the hype that we've talked about, because it basically pushes people towards wanting more of these positive, exciting results. So they in some extreme cases make the results up. That's the fraudsters. They do their publication bias and their p-hacking to get more publications and positive publications and exciting publications. They cut corners and don't check stuff because they're so desperate to get more of these publications that they're just doing too much haste in their research, and they make their results sound more exciting than they are. The hype element, so that they can get them into these places. So I think that need for publication explains the four horsemen that we've discussed. And it also explains some of the other weird behaviors that academics engage in, like salami slicing, where they, take a paper that could have been all written up as one paper, but publish it in 5 different parts, just so it looks like it's longer on their CV. The obsession with metrics like the H index, which is about your number of people that have cited you. Some academics getting involved in like extreme self-citation, where they write papers and half of the results half of the references section is to their own previous work. Self-plagiarizing, you get these weird cases of people publishing basically the same paper over and over and over again in different journals over different years without telling anyone that it's the same paper. So I think it's not like there's like knockdown clear evidence that the incentives structure of science, that this perverse incentive, publish or perish world is causing all our problems. But I think it fits really well. It's a theory that kind of you can make an inference to the best explanation. It fits really well with the problems that we've got. And so I have a chapter in the book where I kind of talk through those incentives of the academic system and how they might affect the quality of our research. And it's a negative effect.
And how would you go about fixing it? Are there sort of feasible changes that don't involve totally overhauling everything that can sort of curtail some of the perverse incentives, or maybe just get better at disincentivizing bad behavior?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of changes that we could make to the academic system. So there's changes to the way we publish articles. I talk in the book about the idea of doing registered reports, which is where you write down your analysis plan, and you write your introductory section and your method section first, and then send it to the journal before you've collected any data, and it gets reviewed. Peer reviewers come in and say, "Well, I wouldn't do it that way. Maybe you should do it this way. You should do it this way," and then you all agree. And the fundamental thing is that the journal agrees to publish your result, no matter which way it goes. So if it's null, if it's positive, if it goes in a weird direction you didn't expect, if it's uninterpretable, the journal will publish it no matter what. And so that kills publication bias stone dead. And there's several hundred journals now that are offering that. In the last few years, they've started to offer that as a publication option, which I think is great and deals with a lot of the problems we've been talking about. You write down your analysis plan before you touch any of the data, which is, gets us around this issue of p-hacking that I talked about before, where you're just kind of meandering around and just doing any old analysis until you find something that looks vaguely like what you wanted. So that, or less stringent ways, which is just, one example would be just posting your analysis plan online, are ways of making research more transparent, of improving the transparency of research. The whole open science movement, where people are encouraged to publish their data online, share it online with each other, share their methods, share their statistical, their computer code that they use to analyze their data, is also part of that whole, improving transparency thing, and not having these articles that are written as if they're, confirmatory hypotheses but are actually exploratory. You see what people are doing all along, and that doesn't kill exploration. You just have to be honest about when you've done an exploratory bit of research and when you haven't. You just have to say, look, the research I was doing was rather exploratory in this case. So that's completely fine to do that, as long as the world knows that that's what you've done, and the reader can come along and say, okay, this person was exploring the data, which is, to be encouraged in many cases.
That would be your paper in that case. If you already wrote the methods up front. So you can imagine a paper where you have your introduction and your methods, you do the analysis, it gets a weird, unexpected or null result, and then you say, well, after looking at this, we figured, oh, maybe we need to change this, and here's this other analysis, and it has this result, and then you kind of see oh, here's what we learned, we didn't just do the exact right analysis from the start, but once we got a look at the data, then it became clear that, this other, that, oh, there was, this nonlinear effect, or our variable was, defined in a way that it was defined in this way, and we should have been looking at it this way or something. But then at least that process would be there on paper.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a transparent documentation of the actual real scientific process, which is often very messy, and often very ad hoc, and often very unplanned, and that's fine as long as everyone can see that. You don't have to be psychic and come up with every possible twist and turn that your analysis might take before you look at it. It's just that you have to have a plan which you generally stick to, and then have a separate section in your paper that says, here's the exploratory analysis, here's the stuff that we came up with after we started looking at the data. So I think that's completely fine, and not to be stigmatized in any way. That's a totally fine thing to do, to say, oh, we didn't think about this, but actually we came up with this, because that's honest. That's actually what you did. And a huge amount of all this, all these problems we've been talking about are due to scientists not being honest about what they actually did.
And maybe they'll find a way to game the system when they have to pre-register their studies. Maybe there are sneaky ways that they can give themselves more leeway or something.
We're already seeing some of that, where the pre-registration plans are not stuck to in anything like the way that they should be, and so on. So there's already kind of issues with that. But at least with registered reports, the journal can really, the journal can actually withhold its permit. It can actually retract its permission. It can say, look, you didn't do what you said you would do here. You haven't followed your plan, so actually we're not going to publish your results. So it's like they call it in principle acceptance of the paper. So not just like a blanket, now you've got a publication. It's you've got a publication if you actually follow the analysis that you plan, and then the reviewers come in again and double check that. So at least that kind of publication deals with that issue. But yeah, absolutely, this isn't a kind of silver bullet, because as we know from medical research, where trials are supposed to be registered, and yet they still often change the outcome that they were looking at, and so on. So they kind of go against their registrations really scarily often.
But at least it's public. That's the big thing. You can still behave badly, but this makes it less easy to hide, and that's good for the sort of social process of science we talked about earlier. That now your peers kind of know what you did, and if it was above board or not. So we're coming up on time here, do you have any concluding thoughts? And feel free to extort the listeners on why they should buy the book.
Well, yeah, I mean, the only other thing to say is that we've talked about the changes to the publication, but there's lots of other changes that I describe. There's a big long chapter at the end of how we fix this problem, how we deal with these issues of fraud and bias and negligence and hype. And there's lots more issues to do with is publishing articles in journals even something that we should be doing anymore? Is this in the age of the internet? Should we change this? Are there really radical ways of rethinking this? What should universities be doing in terms of their hiring, tenure, and all that sort of stuff? What changes should they be making? What changes should funders be making? How do we actually encourage scientists to do this stuff? How do we get them on board with this? And really, the final point, I guess, that it would be good to make is that I wrote this book because I love science, and I think science is extremely important, and it's the best way of discovering things about the world that we have. And it would be really tragic if all the great things about science were ruined by the academic system. And I think we run the risk of that, if the kind of practices that I describe in the book continue. And I think now is a really good time, because we know about the replication crisis. I mean, just knowing that there's this issue happening, and just having these discussions and doing all this kind of introspection about the scientific results that we've been publishing is, I think, half the battle. Right? Is just getting on board with this meta scientific question of what does good science look like? What should good science look like? I think that's part of it. That's one of the main reasons I wrote the book, is to try and get a discussion going about this stuff. And I didn't write this about to try and tear down science, or God forbid, to give ammunition to people who have crackpot beliefs about science, like creationists or anti-vaccine people or whatever. It's about raising our standards across the board, and raising our standards would mean that most of these people with crackpot beliefs would not get a look in. So that's one of the major things I wanted to say is that the reason for talking about this stuff is that now is a great time to try and change things. We've got the internet, we've got resources, we've got the discussion going, so we can move forward and actually make some serious changes to the publication system that might, hopefully, and one shouldn't make strong predictions about this because you never know, and we need to experiment with stuff, but it might deal with these problems of fraud and bias and negligence and hype that are really so pervasive in so many fields of science.
Yeah, and I am very optimistic about the path of science in the next few decades, and I look forward to seeing how people are able to address many of these problems. This concludes our interview. I'll just say the name of the book once more. It's Science Fictions: How Fraud, Bias, Negligence, and Hype Undermine the Search for Truth, by our guest today, Stuart Ritchie, and I'll have a link to it at economicsdetective.com. Stuart, thanks for being on Economics Detective Radio.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for listening all the way to the end of that longer episode of Economics Detective Radio. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. As I mentioned at the end of the show, you can find a link to the book at the show notes page at economicsdetective.com. And if you want to support me and help me to make more great conversations like that, you can click the link to my Patreon page. Patreon lets you make a recurring per episode donation to the show, which encourages me to produce episodes more frequently and helps me to pay the ongoing expenses associated with having this podcast. Special thanks to all the listeners who already support me there. I appreciate each and every one of you. I'll be back soon with another episode. Stay tuned for that one.